It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon at one of the busiest airports in the city. The air was thick with the sound of rolling luggage and the soft murmur of conversations. Passengers hustled between gates, checking flight boards for their departure times, some running, others strolling with coffee in hand. It was just another typical day in the world of air travel until Marcus Johnson and his family arrived at the gate. Marcus, a man in his early 40s, stood tall and confident as he walked through the terminal with his wife, Karen, and their 2 children. His wife, Karen, was a well-dressed woman with an air of grace about her, and their kids, David and Sarah, were quietly chatting with each other as they walked alongside their parents. Though they looked like any other family, their presence felt different. They carried a certain quiet dignity that made them stand out. To anyone paying close attention, Marcus's calm yet commanding presence hinted at something more, something greater. What no one could have known was that Marcus wasn't just a regular businessman. He wasn't just the CEO of a successful company. He owned the very airline they were about to board. The Johnson family was on a private vacation, and Marcus preferred to keep his wealth and influence as low-key as possible. He wasn't one to flaunt his success or seek attention. But on this day, his quiet demeanor was about to be mistaken for something else entirely. As they approached the gate, a flight attendant named Kelly noticed the family. Kelly, a young woman in her mid-20s, had been working for the airline for almost 2 years. She had seen her fair share of demanding passengers and entitled customers, and it had started to wear on her. In her mind, a lot of the people flying were spoiled, expecting the world to bend for them. She had grown tired of catering to customers who thought they deserved special treatment simply because they had money. It was an attitude she wasn't proud of, but she couldn't help it. It had become a reflex over time, a defense mechanism. When the Johnsons arrived at the gate, Marcus calmly approached the counter and greeted Kelly with a polite smile. She didn't recognize him at first. He wasn't one to advertise his wealth, and his clothes weren't flashy, just a simple black suit and a white shirt. His demeanor was easygoing, but there was an unmistakable air of authority about him. "Excuse me," Marcus said softly, "could we please be seated together? It seems there has been an issue with our assigned seats." Kelly, having already dealt with a long list of complaints that morning, was already feeling frustrated. She glanced at the boarding pass, then back at Marcus, assuming this was yet another customer who felt entitled to special treatment. "Well," Kelly replied, her voice just a little too sharp, "you're in economy, so those are your seats. There's nothing we can do unless you want to upgrade." Marcus's eyes stayed calm, but he could sense the subtle condescension in her tone. He wasn't the type to cause a scene, but this was not how he had imagined starting the journey. "I understand," he said, trying to keep the situation light. "However, I was hoping we could move to some seats that are a bit more comfortable, as we're traveling with 2 young children." Kelly glanced at the family for a moment before her gaze shifted to a nearby passenger. "Sir, I'm sorry, but those seats are reserved," she said, her voice cold and distant. "You'll need to take your assigned seats." Marcus could feel his patience starting to fray. He knew better than to argue with someone in customer service, but there was something about Kelly's attitude that rubbed him the wrong way. He glanced at his wife, who looked just as uncomfortable with the situation. Karen didn't say anything but placed a hand on Marcus's arm, silently supporting him. "Can we just speak with someone who can help us?" Marcus asked, keeping his tone measured. Kelly hesitated, looking around for a supervisor, but she was already feeling the pressure. "You'll need to take it up with a supervisor, but they're not going to change your seats," she snapped. "Everyone else has been assigned their places." This wasn't the kind of treatment Marcus was used to. He wasn't angry, just disappointed. His family had been through a lot recently, with work, travel, and the stress of being in the public eye. He didn't want to deal with this sort of trouble before a vacation. Still, he took a deep breath and calmly said, I'm asking for some understanding here. We have two small children, and this should be a simple request. It was at this moment that Kelly made a decision she would soon regret. Frustrated with Marcus's calm yet insistent tone, she turned to a nearby security officer and muttered something about disruptive passengers. Without another word, she gave Marcus and his family a stern look, motioning toward the door. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave the gate, she said, her voice sharp. You're causing a disturbance. Please exit the plane immediately. Marcus's face stiffened. He could feel Karen's hand tighten on his arm, and the kids, confused, looked up at him, not understanding why things were escalating. It was just a small request, a simple request that had been turned into a confrontation. Kelly, please, Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. There's no need for this. But Kelly, clearly stressed, called for airport security to escort them off the plane. The situation quickly escalated into something more than it needed to be. Marcus, Karen, and the children were led away by security, much to the bewilderment of nearby passengers. Some whispered among themselves, while others simply stared, unsure of what had just happened. As Marcus and his family were escorted off the plane, Karen shot a glance at Kelly, whose expression had shifted from confidence to confusion. She watched as the family disappeared into the terminal, her frustration now mingled with doubt. What had just happened? Why had she asked them to leave? As Marcus and his family were escorted off the plane, confusion rippled through the passengers. Whispers started to spread like wildfire, with people exchanging puzzled looks, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before them. The entire episode had been so quick, so unexpected, that no one knew exactly what to think. Some passengers felt uncomfortable, unsure of what had really happened, while others couldn't help but stare at the family being led down the jet bridge. In the midst of it all, Kelly stood behind the gate, her heart racing, wondering if she had made a grave mistake. Meanwhile, Marcus kept his composure. He had always known that in moments of conflict, staying calm was the best course of action. He understood that in situations like this, losing his cool would only escalate things. But despite his calm demeanor, he couldn't help but feel an underlying frustration building inside him. He had tried to handle the situation politely, only to be dismissed without reason. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a personal affront. As they stood in the airport terminal, Karen looked at her husband with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. She could hardly believe what had just happened. What just went wrong? She asked softly, still trying to wrap her head around the situation. Marcus shook his head, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting his wife's gaze. I don't know, but that wasn't necessary. It shouldn't have gone this far. Their children, David and Sarah, were even more confused. Why were we kicked off the plane, Daddy? Sarah asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Marcus crouched down to their level, offering them a reassuring smile, though he was equally uncertain himself. Sometimes people make mistakes, and we just need to stay calm, all right? Everything will be fine. Karen gave him a nod, her mind racing. She had seen Marcus deal with difficult situations before, but this was something else. This wasn't just an uncomfortable situation, it was a matter of dignity, and she could see how much it hurt her husband to be treated this way. As the family walked toward the nearby seating area to try and gather themselves, the situation at the gate was already beginning to snowball. The incident quickly caught the attention of the airport staff, and by the time Marcus and his family were seated, the social media world was beginning to explode. It started with a single tweet. A passenger who had been on the plane shared a brief account of what had just happened. The tweet described how a well-dressed family had been escorted off the plane by security after a disagreement with a flight attendant. The tweet didn't mention the race of the family or the airline they were flying with, but it was enough to spark interest. Within moments, other passengers began sharing their own versions of the story, and the tweet quickly gained traction. As more and more people chimed in, the story spread like wildfire. Soon, hashtags like hashtag passenger mistreatment and hashtag kicked off plane began trending, with people from all over the country offering their opinions. Some sided with Marcus's family, feeling that the flight attendant had overreacted and that the family had been unfairly treated. Others, however, took the flight attendant's side, suggesting that the family had been disruptive or demanding. But one thing was clear: people were outraged, and the situation was growing out of control. Back at the airport, Marcus checked his phone, seeing the notifications flooding in. His eyes narrowed as he read through the tweets and comments. Some were supportive, expressing anger at how his family had been treated, but others were filled with judgment, questioning why a family like his had been involved in such an incident in the first place. He shook his head, feeling a mix of disbelief and frustration. It wasn't just the flight attendant's actions that bothered him, it was the way people had immediately assumed the worst about his family. Karen could see the tension building in her husband. "Don't read them, Marcus," she suggested gently, trying to pull his focus away from the phone. "It's not worth it." But Marcus couldn't help himself. He had built his career by being connected, by staying informed, and now it seemed like the whole world had an opinion on what had just happened. He couldn't ignore it, not when it was being discussed so openly. "I need to see what's being said," Marcus replied quietly, his fingers scrolling through the posts. "I'm not going to let this stand without addressing it." Karen sighed, placing a hand on his arm. She knew he couldn't ignore it, but she also knew that reading through the comments would only add to his stress. "Just don't let it get to you," she said softly, trying to keep her voice calm for both their sake and the kids. David, who had been sitting quietly until now, spoke up. "Mom, why did they kick us off the plane?" he asked again, his voice filled with concern. "I don't get it. We were just asking for better seats." Marcus glanced at his son, his heart heavy. "Sometimes, son, people don't treat you the way you expect them to. And sometimes, people make decisions without thinking." Karen's voice was steady as she added, "But no matter what happens, we always have each other. That's what matters most." As Marcus sat back in his chair, trying to process everything, he heard a familiar sound: the ringing of his phone. It was a call from his assistant, Lisa. He answered quickly, needing to hear from someone who knew the situation firsthand. "Marcus, are you okay?" Lisa's voice was full of concern. "I've been getting calls all morning. The press is starting to ask questions. They're already spinning the story. They want an interview with you." "Lisa, this isn't what I wanted," Marcus said, his voice low. "I just wanted to have a peaceful flight with my family. This is turning into something else." "I understand, but we need to get ahead of this. The media is already framing it as a racial incident. They're saying you were treated unfairly because of your race. You need to make a statement before it gets out of hand." Marcus leaned back in his seat, his fingers running through his hair. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight for something like this. He was used to making headlines for his business achievements, but this wasn't what he'd signed up for. "All right, Lisa," Marcus said after a long pause. "Let's handle this the right way. Let's get in front of it. But I want to be clear, I'm not just letting this go. I want a full investigation into what happened." The call ended, and Marcus looked up to see Karen watching him, waiting for him to speak. "We're going to handle this," he said firmly. "But we need to make sure people understand what really happened. It's not just about the seats, it's about how people treat others." Karen nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of pride and worry. "You're right. And we'll do it together. This won't define us." As they sat there, surrounded by the noise of the terminal, the weight of the situation started to settle in. The story was far from over, and it was clear that Marcus's family would be thrust into a much bigger battle than they had anticipated. The question was no longer just about seats on a plane, it was about dignity, respect, and the way people saw each other. And Marcus was ready to take on whatever came next, for his family and for the truth. The next few hours felt like an eternity for Marcus and his family. After leaving the airport terminal, they found a quiet corner in a nearby cafe, hoping to regain some sense of normalcy. The kids were still a little shaken by what had happened, asking over and over again why they had been kicked off the plane. Karen tried her best to reassure them, but she couldn't hide the worry on her face. She knew that the situation wasn't just about a flight delay anymore, it was about something deeper. And now, it seemed as if the whole world had turned their attention to the incident. Marcus, despite his frustration, stayed calm. He wanted to talk to Karen and the kids, to ease their nerves, but he couldn't stop thinking about what was happening outside their little bubble. His phone buzzed again and again with notifications, and each time he picked it up, the news of the incident was spreading faster. Tweets, Facebook posts, and news outlets all were picking up the story. People were sharing their opinions, and as expected, it wasn't all positive. What started as an angry tweet from a single passenger had now become the focal point of public discourse. Articles had begun to surface, some suggesting that Marcus and his family had been treated unfairly due to racial bias, others focusing on the flight attendant's behavior. The opinions were divided, but what no one knew yet was that Marcus wasn't just a regular businessman. He wasn't just any CEO. He was the CEO of the airline involved. And this was about to change everything. Kelly, meanwhile, was a world away from the confusion and chaos at the airport. She was sitting in a small break room backstage at the airline, trying to make sense of the whirlwind that had followed her actions. The security guard who had escorted Marcus and his family off the plane had been quiet, but the look in his eyes told Kelly everything she needed to know. Her actions had been too hasty. She had made a mistake. But how big of a mistake was still unclear. Kelly had been working for the airline for over a year now. She had seen her fair share of customers who made unreasonable demands, but she had always prided herself on being firm, keeping control of her cabin. But this was different. In hindsight, she could see the way Marcus had acted, calm, composed, and how she had misjudged him. She had assumed he was just another entitled passenger, someone who thought he could manipulate the system. How wrong she had been. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her friend at the airport. "Did you know who that family was?" the message read. Kelly stared at the words in disbelief, her fingers hovering over the screen. She didn't know what it meant. She thought back to the brief interaction, the moment when she had dismissed them so harshly. The message continued, "That was Marcus Johnson, CEO of the airline. They own the whole damn thing." The words hit Kelly like a punch to the gut. She felt a sinking feeling in her stomach as she processed what she had just read. Marcus Johnson. The name rang a bell. She had seen the name in news articles, had heard his company discussed in business circles, but she had never made the connection. She had just kicked the CEO and his family off the plane. She couldn't believe it. Kelly's hands trembled as she quickly pulled up the articles and news posts that were now flooding the internet. There it was, clear as day: Marcus Johnson, the owner of the airline. Her heart raced as she read the latest headlines, some of which were already calling for her job. There were also murmurs of the incident being linked to racial discrimination. She felt her face flush with heat as the weight of what she had done sank in. The hours passed quickly, and as she sat there, the magnitude of her mistake continued to loom over her. She thought back to the words Marcus had spoken to her before being escorted off the plane. He had been calm, but there was a quiet authority in his voice that now haunted her. He had tried to reason with her, to explain the situation without escalating it, but she had ignored him. And now, she had made the situation far worse than it ever needed to be. Meanwhile, Marcus was still grappling with the situation. He had just gotten off the phone with Lisa, his assistant, who had been following the media frenzy. It was clear that the situation had taken on a life of its own. The tweets, the news reports, it was all too much. But Marcus had been through the fire before in business, dealing with competitors, negotiations, and pressure from all sides. What bothered him most, however, wasn't the media, it was the disrespect shown to his family. "Marcus, we need to address this now," Lisa's voice crackled through the phone. "There's already a meeting scheduled with the airline's top executives. They're pulling all their resources together to handle the fallout from this." Marcus sighed. "I know, Lisa. But this is bigger than just a few angry tweets. It's about how people treat each other. I want to make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." His words hung in the air, heavy with determination. He wasn't going to let this go, not after everything his family had been through. The mistreatment was one thing, but the fact that it had happened with the airline he owned, the one he had worked so hard to build, made it personal. Before the meeting with the executives, Marcus decided to take matters into his own hands. He called for a private meeting with Kelly, the flight attendant. He needed to hear her side of the story before the situation spiraled any further. His goal wasn't revenge, it was understanding. He wanted to know how this mistake had occurred, and why Kelly had felt the need to take such extreme action. Meanwhile, Kelly had been called into her supervisor's office. As she walked down the hallway, her heart was pounding in her chest. She had no idea what to expect, but she had a sinking feeling that her career was in jeopardy. The airline executives were already in crisis mode, and she was at the center of it all. As Kelly sat across from her supervisor, the tension was palpable. She wasn't sure how to begin. How could she explain what had happened without sounding like she was making excuses? She knew she had made a mistake, but she also knew that this wasn't just any mistake. It was one that could change everything for her. Her supervisor didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence hang in the room. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. "Kelly, you need to understand the gravity of what's happened. That family you kicked off the plane? That's Marcus Johnson. He owns the airline. Do you understand what that means?" Kelly's face drained of color as the words sank in. She nodded, barely able to speak. "I didn't know. I didn't recognize him." "I know," the supervisor said, his tone softening slightly. "But you made a choice that affected the company's reputation. You put us all in a very difficult position." Kelly's mind raced as she thought back to the events of the day. She had acted impulsively, allowing her own frustrations to cloud her judgment. Now, as she sat here, she realized just how much damage she had caused. She hadn't just lost a job opportunity, she had damaged the reputation of the airline she worked for. The reality of the situation was setting in, and Kelly knew that it was only a matter of time before she would have to face Marcus Johnson himself. The hours after the incident seemed to drag on for Marcus and his family. The day was far from over, and despite their best efforts to shake off the awkwardness, the situation loomed over them like a dark cloud. It was clear that they weren't going to be able to just move past this easily. The media was buzzing, social media was flooded with opinions, and all the while, Marcus remained in the eye of the storm, trying to protect his family from the worst of it. Karen could see the weight of the situation on her husband's face. He was quiet, but she knew that the last thing he wanted was to make a scene. Despite his reputation as a successful CEO, Marcus was a man who valued privacy and peace. Being thrust into the public eye like this wasn't something he enjoyed, and she could sense his frustration growing as he scrolled through the constant notifications on his phone. The news articles weren't letting up, and neither were the people reaching out to him. Finally, after what seemed like an endless barrage of calls, Marcus stood up. He had made his decision. It was time to handle the situation directly. "I'm calling a meeting with the airline's leadership," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Karen nodded, understanding that it was the only way forward. She could see that he wasn't going to let this slip by without addressing it head on. But deep down, she worried about the emotional toll it might take on him. "We're going to make this right," Marcus added, more to himself than anyone else. "But I want to make sure that this doesn't happen to anyone else. It's not just about us anymore." The family gathered their things and made their way to the company's headquarters, a sleek modern building located in the heart of the city. The air was thick with tension as they approached the boardroom, where Marcus knew the top executives were already gathered, waiting for him. Inside the boardroom, the mood was more serious than Marcus had expected. The CEO walked in, his presence commanding attention as the room went quiet. The executives, who were no strangers to high-stakes situations, were all on edge. Everyone knew that the media frenzy around this incident had the potential to damage the reputation of the airline. Marcus, one of the senior executives, Edward, said, standing up as Marcus entered. "We've all been following the situation. It's escalating faster than we anticipated. We need to address this now, before it becomes a bigger problem. The media is already framing it as a racial incident." Marcus took a deep breath and looked around the room. "This is bigger than just some headline," he said, his voice steady. "This isn't just about me or my family. This is about how we, as a company, treat people. It's about the values we stand for. The way we treat our customers should reflect the values we want to project. And right now, our values are in question." The room fell silent as Marcus's words sank in. The executives had no immediate response. It was clear that Marcus wasn't just angry about being kicked off the plane. He was disappointed in how his own company had failed to uphold its own standards of respect and professionalism. "Edward," Marcus continued, "I want a full investigation into what happened. I want to know exactly what led to this incident. And I want accountability for the actions of the flight attendant. If this was a misunderstanding, then we need to make sure it's addressed properly. If there was a mistake made in training, we need to fix that too." Edward nodded, but Marcus could see that the room was divided. Some executives were clearly uncomfortable with Marcus's approach, while others, particularly those who had been with the company for years, nodded in agreement. They understood that this wasn't just about one flight attendant, it was about the culture of the airline. "We'll get to work on the investigation right away," Edward said, though his tone was hesitant. "But we also need to consider how this will impact our brand moving forward. The press will want a statement, and we'll need to address it carefully. People are already calling for action, and we need to show that we're doing something." Marcus stood up and looked around the room. "We're not just going to show that we're doing something. We're going to fix this from the ground up. We need new training for all employees, not just the flight attendants. I want everyone, from the ground crew to the executives, to be aware of how we treat our passengers. No more exceptions. We need to make sure that this never happens again." There was a long pause as the executives digested Marcus's words. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others were nodding, appreciating Marcus's direct approach. No one spoke up immediately, but it was clear that his message had hit home. "I'll personally oversee the review of our training programs," Marcus added. "I want every department to go through sensitivity training. And as for the incident today, I want Kelly to come in and speak with me. I need to hear her side of the story. We'll address the situation with respect, but I also want her to understand the impact of her actions." The room grew quieter, and Edward exchanged glances with the others. "Marcus," he said slowly, "are you sure that's the right way to handle this? Kelly's actions have caused a lot of turmoil. There's a lot of pressure from the public for us to take action quickly." Marcus met his gaze calmly. "We're going to handle this professionally," he said. "This isn't about rushing to judgment. It's about understanding the situation and making sure we're doing the right thing. If Kelly made a mistake, then we'll address it, but I also want to make sure that she has an opportunity to explain herself. I'm not about to punish someone without hearing their side. Edward hesitated but eventually nodded. Understood. We'll start making the arrangements. As the meeting continued, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. His thoughts drifted to Kelly. He had already made up his mind not to fire her after all, people made mistakes. But he knew this was going to be a hard conversation, one that would challenge both of them. Outside the boardroom, Kelly was pacing nervously in the hallway. She had received a call earlier that morning, asking her to come to the company headquarters for a meeting with Marcus. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew it wasn't going to be good. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood outside the door, trying to calm her nerves. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when her actions would be held up to the light. The door opened, and a company representative motioned for Kelly to come in. She hesitated for a moment, then walked in, her heart racing. Marcus was sitting at the head of the table, flanked by several other executives. They all looked at her with varying degrees of concern. She could feel their eyes on her, but it wasn't just the executives she was worried about, it was Marcus himself. Kelly, Marcus said calmly, his voice steady. Thank you for joining us today. I want to start by saying that this isn't about attacking you, it's about understanding what happened. I need to hear your side of the story. And then, we'll figure out the next steps together. Kelly swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. I made a mistake, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't recognize him. I didn't realize who he was, and I acted without thinking. I thought he was just another demanding passenger. But I now realize I was wrong. Marcus nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. I understand that. But I need you to understand something. What you did today wasn't just about a single flight, it was about respect. It's about treating people the right way, no matter who they are. Kelly nodded, her face flushed with regret. She was embarrassed, ashamed even, but she knew this was her chance to make it right. Kelly, Marcus said softly, this is about learning from our mistakes. And it's about making sure that this never happens again, not just for you, but for every single employee at this airline. Kelly looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. She nodded again. I understand, she said, her voice filled with emotion. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. The days that followed the meeting were a whirlwind for Marcus and his family. The press continued to hound them, and the public outcry over the incident showed no signs of slowing down. But amidst the chaos, there was a sense of clarity that Marcus had found. He knew that the only way to move forward was with action, not just words. It wasn't enough to simply apologize for what had happened, he needed to ensure that the airline, and its employees, learned from this mistake. While his family continued their vacation plans, Marcus made it his mission to oversee the changes that needed to be made. He began by working with the airline's leadership team to implement an in-depth review of its internal policies, with a strong focus on customer service, training, and cultural sensitivity. The airline's future, Marcus knew, depended on making sure something like this never happened again. But he also knew that change started with understanding. One afternoon, Marcus sat down with Kelly for their follow-up conversation. This meeting was different from the one they had in the boardroom, where the tension had been thick and uncomfortable. Now, there was a sense of openness between them. Marcus had made it clear that he didn't want to rush to judgment, he wanted to understand her perspective and make sure that the right lesson was learned, not just by her, but by everyone working for the airline. When Kelly arrived at his office, she was visibly more at ease than the first time they had spoken. She had taken some time to reflect on the situation, and she knew that the upcoming conversation would be crucial. The pressure she had felt in the days following the incident had only deepened her understanding of the gravity of her actions. She was ready to take responsibility, but more than that, she was ready to change. "Marcus, I just want to start by saying again how sorry I am," Kelly said as she sat down across from him. "I never intended for any of this to happen. I was wrong to make assumptions, and I should have handled the situation differently." Marcus looked at her calmly, his expression soft. "Kelly, I appreciate you saying that. But it's not just about saying sorry, it's about making sure we learn and grow from this. I've been in situations where I've made mistakes, and I can tell you, the hardest part is owning up to them and learning from them. But that's the only way to move forward, both as an individual and as part of a company." Kelly nodded, understanding the weight of his words. She had spent the past few days thinking long and hard about her actions, about the assumptions she had made and the decisions she had rushed into. It hadn't been just a mistake, it had been a lesson, one that she would carry with her for the rest of her career. "I've been through some training," Kelly continued, "but I realize now that it wasn't enough. I didn't fully understand how my actions could affect the people I'm serving. I didn't take the time to see them as people first, to understand their needs. And that's something I'm committed to changing moving forward." Marcus appreciated her honesty. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but Kelly's willingness to reflect and learn was an important first step. "What matters now is that you're willing to grow. That's what we all need to do, not just you, but everyone who works for this airline. We've started making changes in our training programs. Every employee will go through enhanced customer service training, focusing on empathy, understanding, and respect. We're also bringing in outside experts to help us address unconscious bias and better support all our passengers, no matter who they are." Kelly's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected such a comprehensive approach. "I didn't realize the scale of what you were doing. I thought it would just be about me." "No, Kelly," Marcus said with a smile. "It's not just about you. It's about making sure that we as a company hold ourselves to a higher standard. I believe that if we treat people with respect and fairness, it will reflect in the service we provide. And that starts with us as leaders in the company." Kelly felt a deep sense of gratitude. This was a chance for her to prove herself, not just to Marcus, but to the entire company. She had been given an opportunity to change, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity," she said sincerely. "I won't let you down." Marcus nodded, his voice calm yet firm. "I believe in second chances, Kelly. But the most important thing is that you're willing to use this experience to grow. That's what will make the difference." As they talked, Kelly could feel a shift in herself. It wasn't just about repairing the damage that had been done, it was about becoming someone better. The conversation was an eye-opener, not just for her, but for everyone in the company who would undergo similar training. She had made a mistake, but it wasn't the mistake that defined her, it was what she did next. Marcus had been through many challenges in his life, but this was one of those rare moments where he felt that he wasn't just a leader in business, he was leading by example. The more he reflected on the incident, the more he realized that this was an opportunity for the airline to rebuild its foundation on the principles of understanding and respect. His company had grown by taking risks and challenging the status quo, and now it was time for them to do the same within their own operations. Over the next few weeks, the company began to implement the new training programs. The airline's leadership team, including Marcus, attended the sessions alongside employees to ensure that everyone understood the importance of the changes. Kelly became one of the vocal advocates for the new training, speaking at employee meetings about how her perspective had shifted. She shared her story, not as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of how easy it was to let assumptions cloud judgment. The airline began to receive positive feedback from passengers who noticed the change in attitude among the staff. Complaints about customer service dropped significantly, and the airline's reputation slowly began to heal. Marcus received a message from one of the passengers who had been on the flight with his family. The message was short but meaningful. Thank you for handling the situation with such grace. You've set an example for how we should all treat each other. As for Marcus, he knew that this wasn't just about public relations or fixing a problem, it was about creating a lasting change in how people treated each other. The incident had forced him to reflect on his own leadership style and the impact his company had on the world. But in the end, it was about the lessons learned, the lessons that made everyone better, more understanding, and more empathetic toward one another. Months later, as the airline celebrated a significant milestone, Marcus stood before his team at the annual company gathering. The mood was light, filled with laughter and celebration, but there was a deeper sense of pride in the air. The company had come through a difficult time, not by running from the problem, but by confronting it head-on and making real, meaningful change. Marcus looked around at the faces of the people who had helped build this airline, and he couldn't help but smile. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice strong and steady. "And we're just getting started." Kelly stood among the crowd, smiling to herself. She had learned a lot from her mistake, and now, she was part of something bigger. A company that not only provided excellent service but also believed in doing the right thing, no matter the circumstances. For Marcus and his team, it had been a challenging journey, but it was also one of growth, understanding, and transformation. The road ahead was full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt truly proud of the company he had built.